Welcome. I'd like to take a bit of time to talk more about the structure and content of the licensure examination, and hopefully it will give you an additional perspective on why the exam is difficult to pass and the implications it has for studying. Let's consider the purpose of the exam, which is to measure your knowledge, abilities, and behaviors for social work practice. The test has a serious design problem, which has prevented anybody from gathering any good evidence for its validity and reliability. In fact, the evidence actually speaks against the validity of the exam. While there are different content domains that comprise the exam, the domains are imprecisely defined. This means it is difficult to know what you should actually be studying. For example, there are theories of practice, which may include cognitive behavioral therapy, psychodynamic theory, and systems theory. There are 297 different DSM mental disorders that are contained in the DSM that may be included on the exam. And there's theories of human development and additional questions on medications. Many of the questions you face are presented in the form of cases and vignettes, which means that the number of possible test questions is really approaching infinity. So the core of our study system is to provide you with strong coverage of content areas across all the different domains that have a high probability of being on the exam. We are far more interested in exposing you to a full range of possible content and questions that might be on the exam, as opposed to providing you with a narrowly defined study guide. The latter simply does not exist. By focusing on broad-based coverage, you're more likely to build meaningful connections between the content areas you are studying, which will give you a better chance of having the necessary knowledge for answering any given test question. Here are a few other suggestions I think are highly relevant to your study preparations. First, don't be overly concerned about how you perform on the self-assessment. You can easily calculate your percentage correct, but be careful inferring that will reflect your actual score on the exam. Use these scores as a general indicator of your knowledge and comfort with the content area, but be sure to move on to subsequent modules. You can return to any given module, but the most important thing is exposure to content. Second, the content you review should be considered from an applied perspective. Always ask yourself how it may apply to decision making with a client. Third, the supplementary content is to provide additional content exposure. If you complete any given module and have additional time for studying, try to expose yourself to new content or content that is presented in a different way. The test is really a reflection of an entire MSW curriculum, and there are so many different things could be covered. Fourth, the test questions and self-assessments are, indeed, to help you practice the content you have studied. Keep in mind that the questions are also about building up endurance for the exam and practicing standardized questions. Again, don't worry if you aren't performing very well on the questions. Getting a question wrong isn't a function of knowing or not knowing the content on the exam. It could be test fatigue, which has resulted in errors with responding or with reading or responding to the questions. It could be test anxiety, which prevented you from actually accessing the correct information, which is very common and relatively easy to address. It could be your strategy for dealing with ambiguous questions. For example, did you impute unnecessary details in a question? So as you go through your self-assessment, try to figure out whether your incorrect answers were due to lack of knowledge or something else. We welcome questions or comments to all the matters discussed, so be sure to post it to our online community.